An army, machine guns, 20,000 birds. The birds won. I was there, well, almost. Hold my mead. Here is the question history textbooks skip over. How does a modern army equipped with automatic weapons lose a military campaign against flightless birds? Not lose in the sense of a tactical retreat, not lose on a technicality. Lose decisively, embarrassingly, and twice. The Australian government deployed soldiers and machine guns against emus in the wheat belt of Western Australia in the autumn of 1932, and within weeks the operation was quietly, shamefully abandoned. Then they tried again, and lost again. The official record frames this as a minor administrative curiosity, a footnote about pest control gone sideways. But that framing is exactly what we should resist, because the Emu War is not a joke. It is a case study in institutional arrogance, the assumption that superior firepower automatically translates into control over a complex living problem. Soldiers, politicians, and generals all believed the same thing, Bitsai. That this would be simple, that it would be fast, that the birds would not adapt. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong. So, before we get to the guns and the feathers and the chaos in the fields, we need to understand the world that made this campaign feel not just reasonable, but inevitable. Because the real mystery is not that it failed. The real mystery is why anyone thought it would work in the first place. To understand 1932, you have to understand what Western Australia's wheat belt was and who was living on it. After the First World War, the Australian government had settled thousands of returned soldiers on marginal farming land in the interior, a scheme built on patriotic gratitude and almost no agricultural realism. The soil was thin, the rainfall unreliable, and the global wheat market was already beginning the collapse that would define the Great Depression. These men had survived the trenches. Now they were being slowly bankrupted by the land they had been promised as a reward. By the early 1930s, many of these soldier settlers were desperate. And into that desperation came the emus, tens of thousands of them, migrating as they always had, following ancient routes toward water and food. The wheat fields were new, but to an emu, a field of grain is simply a field of grain. The birds had no way of knowing they were trespassing on someone's last chance. They moved through fences as if the fences were suggestions. They ate, they trampled, they kept moving. The settlers petitioned Canberra with the kind of urgency that comes from genuine ruin. And Canberra, faced with men who had fought for their country and were now watching birds eat their livelihoods, made the decision that would become legend. They sent the army. But what the army found when it arrived was not what anyone had expected. The man Canberra sent was Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery. He arrived in the Campion district in early November 1932 with 2 Lewis guns, 10,000 rounds of ammunition, and what appears to have been complete confidence. The logic was sound on paper. A Lewis gun fires hundreds of rounds per minute. Emus are large, slow, and flightless. The math, by any military calculation, should have been straightforward. Meredith and his small team, just 2 other soldiers, planned to herd the birds into a tight group near a dam, wait for them to cluster, and then open fire. It was the kind of plan that works beautifully in a briefing room. The operation began on the 2nd of November, and almost immediately, nothing went right. The emus refused to cluster. The birds that had been moving in enormous massed groups for weeks seemed to sense the ambush. Or perhaps they simply behaved as large animals under threat always behave, scattering in every direction the moment the guns opened up. The first engagement produced far fewer casualties than expected. The guns jammed in the dust. The birds that were hit did not fall cleanly. Witnesses, including Meredith himself, noted that emus seemed to absorb bullets and keep moving, their small vital organs protected by dense muscle and feather. The army had arrived expecting a slaughter. What they got instead was a lesson in biology. But the worst was still to come. Here is where the story stops being funny and starts being genuinely strange. Ornithologists who have studied emus note that the bird's anatomy is, in a practical sense, remarkably difficult to kill quickly. The heart and lungs are set deep within a large muscular body. An emu can sustain significant trauma and continue moving, not through any supernatural resilience, but through sheer biological architecture. Major Meredith reportedly compared them to Zulus, noting that they could take a number of bullets that would kill a man and still keep running. That comparison tells us something uncomfortable about Meredith's frame of reference, but it also tells us something real about the birds. The Lewis guns, designed for trench warfare against human targets, were not optimized for this particular problem, and the emus were not standing still to be optimized against. They had begun to change their behavior. Where before they had moved in vast, dense mobs, they now moved in smaller, dispersed groups, harder to target, harder to herd, impossible to mass kill with a fixed gun position. Whether this was conscious adaptation or simply the natural behavior of a prey animal under pressure is a question biologists still debate, but the tactical effect was identical either way. The army was fighting an enemy that was, in effect, decentralizing in real time. By mid-November, with ammunition running low and the kill count far below projections, the operation was suspended. The newspapers had already started to notice, and they were not kind. The suspension of the operation in mid-November 1932 did not end the story. It escalated it into politics. Members of Parliament began debating the campaign in terms that ranged from the genuinely concerned to the openly satirical. One member reportedly suggested the emus deserved medals for their performance. The Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, had authorised the operation and was now bearing the full weight of its failure, earning the nickname Minister for the Emu War in the press, a label he found considerably less amusing than the public did. But here is the part that gets overlooked in the retelling. The political response was not to address the underlying problem. Nobody in Canberra seriously reconsidered the soldier-settler scheme or the structural impossibility of farming marginal land during a global depression or the ecological reality that emus had been migrating through this region long before the farms arrived. Instead, they argued about the guns. They debated tactics. They asked whether better positioning might have improved the kill rate. And then in early December, they sent Meredith back. The second campaign was marginally more successful in terms of raw numbers. But the emus were still there. The farms were still failing. The fundamental problem had not moved an inch. The guns had not solved anything. They had simply given everyone something to argue about while the real crisis continued. Which raises the question, was the campaign ever really about the emus at all? Let us pause here and ask the question the campaign never asked. What were the emus actually doing, and why? Emus are nomadic. They follow rainfall, moving across hundreds of kilometers of interior Australia in patterns shaped over tens of thousands of years. The wheat belt had been carved out of land those migration routes crossed naturally. The farms were, from the emu's perspective, not an intrusion. They were simply the landscape as it now existed. The birds were not attacking, they were migrating. And the crops they were eating were not incidental damage, and they were the most nutritious food source in a landscape that had been dramatically altered by European agriculture. Ecologists who have studied the region note that the clearing of native scrub for wheat farming had itself disrupted the food web in ways that concentrated emu movement rather than dispersing it. In other words, the farming that the soldier settlers depended on had, in part, created the conditions that made emu incursions worse. This is the uncomfortable loop at the heart of the Emu War. The solution, more farming, more fences, more guns, was also, in a measurable sense, part of the cause. Meredith's guns could not shoot their way out of an ecological feedback loop. No army can. And yet the instinct to reach for the gun rather than examine the system is not a 1932 instinct. It is a very old one. Which brings us to what actually ended the crisis, and it was not bullets. The Emu War did not end with a decisive military victory. It ended gradually and undramatically with fences. Long, government-funded boundary fences that physically redirected emu movement away from the most vulnerable farmland. It ended with bounty schemes that paid individual shooters per bird rather than deploying soldiers en masse. It ended, in other words, with policy. Slow, unglamorous, structural policy that addressed the actual problem rather than performing a response to it. The military campaigns of 1932 killed some emus. The number is disputed and the records are unreliable, but no serious historian claims the campaign came close to the figures the army had projected. More importantly, the emus that remained adapted. Their behavior during the campaigns, the dispersal into smaller groups, the avoidance of open ground, had demonstrated something that military planners had not accounted for. That a decentralized living system does not have a command structure you can destroy. You cannot shoot the general of an emu flock. There is no general. The lesson of the Emu War is not that the Australian army was incompetent, though the campaign was certainly handled badly. The lesson is structural. When a government faces a complex, living, adaptive problem and responds with blunt, concentrated force, it is not solving the problem. It is performing the appearance of control. The emus did not win because they were clever. They won because the army was asking the wrong question entirely, and that mistake, as we will see, has not stayed in 1932. The Emu War endures as a punchline. It should endure as a warning. Every time a government faces a complex, adaptive, systemic problem, ecological collapse, mass migration, economic disruption, and responds by sending something that fires, it is replaying 1932. The emus did not defeat the Australian army through cunning. They defeated it through sheer structural reality. You cannot impose a military solution on a problem that is, at its root, a failure of policy. The birds are still out there. The lesson is still waiting to be learned. If that made you see something familiar in a story you thought was just absurd, subscribe to Ash and Marble. New episode every week. And that actually happened. Humans? Bless 'em, I'm Bram, the deathless bard, and I've got 1,000 more where that came from. Pull up a stool. Subscribe.